Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Tatarovich, and on behalf of New York State DEC, Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, and Erie County, I'd like to welcome you to the Buffalo River AOC public meeting, where I'll be presenting the case for the removal of the degradation of benthos beneficial use impairment. I'd like to acknowledge that this has not just been a DEC effort, but there have been many agencies and organizations that over the past few decades that have made efforts to remediate and restore the river. So today's presentation will provide a very simplified overview of the degradation of benthos BUI report. Recently, we've had the restrictions on dredging BUI removed late last year, and then also currently in the process of removing the loss of fish and wildlife BUI. The degradation of benthos report is posted on Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper's website for 30 days. Originally posted on May 12th and will be there until June 11th. We want to encourage you to review the report and submit any comments, thoughts, or questions to us through the website, which will be shared in the chat. So the outline for this presentation, I'd first like to provide some background on the AOC program and also the Buffalo River Remedial Action Plan. Then I'll describe what a BUI criteria is, focusing on the degradation of benthos BUI. And then after the presentation, we'll have time for questions and discussion. So in 1972, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, 43 of the most polluted locations around the Great Lakes were identified as areas of concern. An area of concern, or AOC, is a location that has experienced environmental degradation, mostly due to former heavy industry and manufacturing that's resulted in the degradation of natural resources in these areas. There are 26 AOCs in the United States and 12 in Canada, and 5 that are binational, so they're managed jointly by Canada and the US. 9 of the 43 have been removed from the list, 6 of them being in the US. So focusing on New York State, we have 6 AOCs in New York. First, going from west to east, we have the Buffalo River, the Niagara River, 18 Mile Creek, the Rochester Embayment, Oswego River, which was delisted in 2006, and the St. Lawrence River. So focusing on Buffalo River, the AOC boundary extends along the historically industrialized portion of the river, beginning at the mouth and continuing approximately 6 miles upstream to the Bailey Avenue Bridge. It also contains the entire 1.4 mile stretch of the City Ship Canal located adjacent to the river, and a large extent of the Buffalo River and City Ship Canal within the AOC boundary is designated as a federal navigation channel, which is maintained and routinely dredged by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to a depth of 22 to 23 feet below water datum. So here's a larger image of the Buffalo River AOC, and you can see in pink, that's the area that is regularly dredged by the Army Corps and known as the Federal Navigation Channel. The International Joint Commission, or IJC, defined 14 potential beneficial use impairments an AOC can have under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Beneficial use impairments represent different types of significant environmental degradation. Of 14 possible BUIs identified by the IJC, 9 BUIs were identified for the Buffalo River AOC. Here, there's a key in the top right corner where the dark blue BUIs are not applicable to Buffalo River, or they're not impaired. These are restrictions on drinking water consumption or taste and odor problems, degradation of phytoplankton and zooplankton populations, eutrophication or undesirable algae, beach closings, and added cost to agriculture and industry. The green BUIs have been removed. We have restrictions on dredging activities, degradation of aesthetics, and tainting of fish and wildlife. And then the BUIs that are currently in progress for removal are degradation of benthos and loss of fish and wildlife. And the BUIs in white are currently have not been assessed for BUI removal yet. Here's the step-by-step process from identification to removal of BUIs. BUIs for the Buffalo River were originally identified in the 1989 Remedial Action Plan, which I'll get into on the next slide. If the causes were identified, they were listed in the RAP. For BUIs where causes were unknown, Additional assessments were recommended to determine causes. Once the cause is identified, criteria is developed for cleanup and restoration for each BUI. Next is mitigating, assessing, and monitoring to ensure restoration targets and criteria have been met. And then the BUI can be removed. This is where a report is developed that makes the case for why and how the BUI criteria is met, meaning there's no longer any impairment for the specific beneficial use. We're currently in this process of the step for the degradation of benthos BUI. And then when all BUIs in the AOC are removed, the AOC can be delisted. So in this case, once all 9 BUIs in the Buffalo River are removed, we can begin that process of delisting for the Buffalo River AOC. Back in the 80s and 90s, through collaborative processes, remedial action plans, or RAPs, were developed to provide the roadmap for restoring the beneficial uses and ultimately delisting AOCs. In 1987, a group of citizens, scientists, and stakeholders, along with New York State DEC, formed the Buffalo River Remedial Advisory Committee. The degradation of benthos BUI was originally listed as impaired in the 1989 Stage 1 and 2 RAP due to low diversity and abundance of the benthic macroinvertebrate community and evidence of sediment toxicity. In the 2011 addendum to the RAP, additional assessments and studies identified that routine dredging and low dissolved oxygen pockets within the Buffalo River impacted macroinvertebrate communities. Proposed actions to restore BUIs included the cleanup of contaminated sediments and to address upland sources of contaminants. So in 2021, the Buffalo River RAC formed a subcommittee to review the existing criteria and examine whether data indicated the criteria was met. The criteria reads that benthic macroinvertebrate communities are non-impacted or slightly impacted according to New York State DEC indices, and in the absence of conclusive community structure data, the toxicity of sediment-associated contaminants is not statistically higher than controls. So before I get into assessments, I wanted to go over what benthos are. Benthos are organisms that occupy the lowest level of a body of water, including the sediment surface and subsurface layers. This graphic shows where the benthic zone is located, which is on, in, and right above the top sediment layer at the bottom of a river or lake. Common benthos in the Great Lakes are crustaceans, worms and leeches, insect larvae such as mayflies and midges, snails, clams, and mussels. I just wanted to note that the photo on the right here is an image of invasive quagga mussels. Benthos can also be called macroinvertebrates or benthic organisms. You also hear me calling them bugs. So I've explained what they are, but why do they matter? Macroinvertebrates play a key role in nutrient cycling in aquatic ecosystems because they are the primary processors of organic materials and are a food source for fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Macroinvertebrates indices are commonly used to analyze the health of freshwater streams and have a wide range of pollution tolerances that can be classified into 3 groups: sensitive, tolerant, and very tolerant. So the composition of the macroinvertebrate community can tell us the water quality status of a particular body of water. So I showed this graphic earlier, but I'm going to be focusing on the 4th step to mitigate and assess and monitor. Specifically, for the degradation of benthos, the RAP identified the need to mitigate upland sources of pollution and cleanup of contaminated sediments in the Buffalo River. Then assess the status of the macroinvertebrate community and determine if the organisms were impacted by contaminants in the sediments. Upland site remediation was conducted through the State Superfund program, and this was separate from AOC activities. This map can be viewed on the DEC info locator on DEC's website, where anyone can go and review remediation sites and access the reports for additional info if available. Studies in recent years documented a reduction in contaminant concentrations within the sediments in the Buffalo River, which confirms improvement of sediment and water quality. So now to the cleanup of the bottom sediments in the Buffalo River. Cleanup of river sediments was done under the Great Lakes Legacy Act and also through dredging by the Army Corps of Engineers. This effort was led by the Great Lakes Legacy Act, and which was passed in Congress or by Congress in 2002 for the purpose of cleaning up contaminated sediments within the Great Lakes AOCs. Specifically for the Buffalo River, the Great Lakes Legacy Act funded baseline sampling to evaluate the effects of sediments on the Buffalo River ecosystem, a feasibility study for remedial action, the remedial design report, and a portion of dredging activities and other restoration efforts as shown in this map. So here in blue, we have all of the areas where the Buffalo River was dredged under the Legacy Act. And then in green, we can see habitat restoration funded by the Legacy Act. And also the yellow at the tip of the city ship canal was where there was capping done of contaminated sediments. And then there's also a few areas in pink where there was areas were backfilled to also cap contaminated sediments. And then lastly, under the Great Lakes Legacy Act, monitoring 2 and 5 years after dredging was also funded. So here's a summary of substantial and more recent dredging activities. The Great Lakes Legacy Act dredging began in 2011 and was completed in 2015. The Army Corps of Engineers dredged the navigational channel, while remediation of areas outside the nav channel were led by EPA and Honeywell Incorporated. So over 1 million cubic yards of sediment were removed as part of Great Lakes Legacy Act activities. Also, the Army Corps routinely dredges the navigation channel about every 2 to 3 years, as shown in this table. You can see that they dredged in 2015, 2018, 2020, and 2022. So I've gone over the mitigation efforts. Now I want to provide an overview of the monitoring and assessments conducted for the degradation of benthos BUI. I briefly mentioned the baseline sampling conducted under Legacy Act activities, and macroinvertebrate community data was collected in 2008. And I also talked about the remedial dredging completed in 2015. So now I'm going to focus on the post-remedial monitoring conducted in 2017 and 2020, along with the sediment toxicity sampling that occurred in 2018, completed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Under the Great Lakes Legacy Act, post-remedial monitoring included conducting bathymetric surveys, sediment chemistry analyses, biological community surveys, and habitat surveys. Since we're focusing on the degradation of benthos BUI, the removal report and this presentation focus on the benthic macroinvertebrate community surveys. In addition, USGS with New York State DEC conducted macroinvertebrate community sampling and sediment toxicity sampling 2 and 5 years post-remedial dredging, and this was separate from the Great Lakes Legacy Act. And then also in 2018, the Army Corps completed the sediment evaluation, their sediment evaluation to determine if the Buffalo River sediments would meet criteria for open lake placement. And so part of that analysis included sediment toxicity sampling, which I'll go into detail later. There were 2 sampling methods used to conduct macroinvertebrate community sampling. Sediment samples were collected using petite ponar grabs, which directly sample organisms living in the sediments. Here's a photo of the process. And samples for the Buffalo River were collected in 2008 by Environ, 2017 by Rambo, and also in 2020 by Rambo on behalf of Honeywell. And the second was deploying Hester Dendy multiplates. They provide standardized artificial habitat at all sites and eliminate site differences, such as different substrate types, such as mud, sand, or cobble. Here's a photo of what the multiplate samplers look like. And also the samples were collected in 2008, 2017, and 2020. So when processing ponar grabs, a minimum count of 100 organisms is required per New York State DEC standard operating procedures, and multiplates require a minimum count of 250 organisms. And this will be important to recall later in the presentation. So here is a map of all the sample locations. The Great Lakes Legacy Act samples are represented by the orange circles and the purple triangles, and include reference sites Casanova Creek and Tonawanda Creek, which is not shown in this map. It's located north of the Buffalo River. And then USGS reference sites located upstream of the Buffalo River. They're the red dots on the map. The reference locations were in Buffalo Creek. So before I get into the results, I just wanted to provide an outline of the data that I'll be going over. So first, I want to talk about macroinvertebrate community assessments. First, I'll go over the USGS and DEC data, followed by Great Lakes Legacy Act data. And then I also want to talk about the DEC Rotating Integrated Basin Studies, or RIBS data. And then I will talk about sediment toxicity testing conducted by USGS DEC, and also the 2018-20 data. So here's some background on how a macroinvertebrate community is measured. The composition of a macroinvertebrate community is determined by calculating the biological assessment profile. The level of impact to the community is determined by individual community metrics, such as species richness and abundance, percent tolerant organisms, percent intolerant organisms, and these metrics are averaged and combined to create a BAP score. So if a sample receives a BAP score of less than 2.5, it's considered severely impacted. A BAP score between 2.5 and 5 is moderately impacted. BAP score between 5 and 7.5 is slightly impacted. And the community is considered non-impacted if the BAP score is greater than 7.5. So this assessment provides an accurate means of water quality assessment by integrating the overall effects of multiple stressors to a benthic community. This graphic shows the data collected by USGS and DEC. So the BAP scores in 2017 indicate the benthic community is moderately to slightly impacted. And in 2020, the benthic community to be severely to slightly impacted. A statistical model indicated that the main factors for these BAP scores was channelization of the river, causing slower flows downstream at the mouth compared to upstream. The AOC portion of the river has greater depth due to routine dredging and historical river channel alteration. And these conditions lead to finer bed sediments, lower dissolved oxygen levels, and greater relative abundance of zebra mussels at sites in the AOC as compared to sites in the reference area. Zebra mussel abundance within the Buffalo River AOC likely affected BAP scores, since BAP scores produce a high score for balanced communities, but a dominance of a single species will lead to a lower BAP score. This graph shows BAP scores for the Ponar direct sediment grabs for the 2008 baseline data, the 2017, and for 2020. In 2008, nearly all BAP scores were in the severely impacted category. Sampling conducted 2 and 5 years after remedial activities produced BAP scores in the severely to moderately impacted categories. The next graph presents BAP scores from the multi-plate samplers. Baseline samples were scored in the moderately to slightly impaired categories. Same goes for the 2017 data. And then in 2020, BAP scores were the lowest, including reference locations. And samples in areas 2A and 2B were not able to be recovered, which is why we don't see the data for those. Again, there's no consistent pattern from these results, implying that the macroinvertebrate community was not influenced by factors directly associated with the Buffalo River, and these factors being low organism counts during the 2020 event, generating fewer than 100 and 250 organisms for the respective sample methods, including reference locations. And that impacted the BAP scoring. In 2020, instead of 100 bugs, the average collected was 8 in the Buffalo River and Cazenovia Creek, which was the reference location. And then the other reference location, Tonawanda Creek, had an average of 7 organisms for Ponar grabs. And then multi-plate sampling produced under 50 bugs on average for the Buffalo River and reference site, which is under the required 250. Also, the 2020 sampling event conducted earlier in the year than previous events to avoid conflict with dredging activities that were scheduled for August. So sampling took place in July. Previous events, the 2008 and 2017 sample events took place in late August, September, and September, October. That year had high temperatures and low dissolved oxygen concentrations compared to previous years, which was also a factor for the different outcome of BAP scores. And then lastly, regular dredging contributes to lake-like conditions with slower flows, providing advantage to zebra mussels, especially in downstream areas of the Buffalo River. I also wanted to share additional data, the DEC rotating integrated basin studies data for the Buffalo River site. And RIBS is intended to assess water quality throughout the entire state. And more specifically, the Buffalo River sample site is located about 115 feet downstream the Ohio Street Bridge. The process for this sampling is suspending a multiplate in the water 1 meter below water surfaces. So this data reflects water quality more directly than benthic community conditions, but the score has regularly been slightly impacted in the slightly impacted category over time. And it's nice to be able to see like a long-term data set. The dip in 2015 was likely from post-remedial activities. So going back to the degradation of benthos BUI removal criteria, I went over the benthic community data, stating the multiple factors that affected the BAP scores, such as physical alteration of the river, the presence of invasive zebra mussels, low bug counts, and annual variability, for example, temperature. And these contributed to inconsistent findings and indicate that the community data is inconclusive. Therefore, we must evaluate the second part of the criteria. Are the AOC sediments toxic to benthic organisms? The toxicity testing was conducted on 2 organisms, the first being Hylela azteca, as a small freshwater crustacean that inhabits the sediment surface. It's an ideal choice for toxicity testing due to its sensitivity to contaminants in sediments. The second is Chironomus dilutus, which is a midge fly. They inhabit wide geographical areas and are also sensitive to nutrients and contaminants, making them a good candidate for toxicity testing. The testing is conducted using standard US EPA methods. It's a 10-day test conducted in a lab where bugs are exposed to a sediment sample. And for 10 days, the bugs are fed and observed. And so then on the 10th day, the water quality is measured and the bugs are collected and counted for survivors. For H. azteca, criteria for sediment toxicity is if mortality is greater than 10% compared to reference sites. And for C. dilutus, if the mortality is greater than 20% compared to reference sites. So this table shows survival rates and growth of both organism species using sediment samples collected by USGS and DEC. The table provides an average survival rates for the bugs within the Buffalo River AOC and the reference locations for both 2017 and 2020. So here we see that the survival for C. dilutus in 2017 and 2020 in both the AOC and reference sites were in the 90s, and there was the reference sites in 2017 had a survival rate of 82.9, about 83%. And then for H. azteca, we also see them the survival rates being in the high 90s. In 2020, the reference site was 93.3%, but we can see that the survival rates and the growth were high for both the AOC and reference sites. None of the 8 AOC sample sites met the criteria for toxicity. In 2018, the Army Corps conducted sediment sampling to analyze suitability for open water placement in Lake Erie and to determine the status of the restrictions on dredging activities BUI. As part of the sediment evaluation, sediment toxicity testing was conducted using the same organisms and the same US EPA method. The Army Corps used a reference site in Lake Erie, and again, we can see that survival rates and growth are high in the AOC and in the reference location. The average survival rates for H. azteca and C. dilutus were 96 and 97% compared to reference locations with survival rates of 96 and 94. Again, none of these sites meet the EPA criteria for toxicity, meaning the Buffalo River sediments were not toxic to benthic organisms. So to summarize, I've discussed the remedial activities implemented under the Great Lakes Legacy Act and also dredging that was conducted by the Army Corps Engineers. I've also reviewed the monitoring assessments conducted in 2017 and 2020 after the completions of remedial activities, and I've also explained how the removal criteria has been met and why the BUI is ready to be removed. As a reminder, the full BUI report can be accessed through the link in the chat. And I'd also like to share a link to the USGS and DEC paper that was published in 2021, which presents additional detail on sampling methods and an analysis of the data to determine whether the BUI was eligible to be removed. So next steps, I just want to again remind you all about the link to the report in the chat, and that the report will be available until June 11th. And so after June 11th, we will submit the final report to EPA and are expecting the BUI to be removed in July. Beyond DEC, I'd like to acknowledge partner organizations who have contributed to the restoration of the Buffalo River AOC. So a big thank you to them and others that may not be up on the slide. And thank you for your time and participating in this meeting. And we will now go to questions.